Hello. So welcome everyone. I want to introduce everyone to the 1619 Project, the Legacy of Literature, and we'll be discussing some of the literary works and some of the prose works of history from the 1619 Project. So thank you for joining us at the Watson Institute. I want to introduce our fantastic panelists. We have Jacqueline Woodson, we have Taya Miles, and we have Nicole Terez Dutton. So I'm going to introduce each of them. I'll go ahead and begin with Taya Miles. Taya Miles is a Radcliffe alumni professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and a professor of history at Harvard University. She is a public historian, an academic historian, and creative writer whose work explores the intersections of African American, Native American, and women's histories. Her temporal and geographical zones of greatest interest include the 19th century US South, Midwest, and West. She is an award-winning author of 5 books and the co-editor of a collection of essays. Her most recent book, The Dawn of Detroit, which I was just discussing with Nicole Hannah-Jones, A Chronicle of Slavery and Freedom in the City of the Straits, won a 2018 American Book Award and the 2018 James A. Raway Prize, and a 2018 Merle Curtiz Social History Award, and the 2017 James Bradford Biography Prize. And it is a 2018 Michigan Notable Book and New York Times Editor's Choice. She is the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, a New Directions Fellowship from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And she is one of our fantastic guests today. And I have respected Professor Miles for years and years. I mean, she probably doesn't remember when she came to visit at UT Austin and I was there, but at the World Field Center and also for their American Studies department. But I'm so grateful to have her here. Next up, we have Nicole Terez Dutton, who is the author of If One of Us Should Fall, from the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2012, and is the winner of the 2011 Cave Canem Poetry Prize. She was formerly the editor of Transition Magazine at Harvard University, and she is currently the brand new editor of the Kenyon Review. This is kind of a sea change and a great sort of monumental event to have Nicole Terez Dutton at the helm of the Kenyon Review. She teaches at the Stolzfus Low Residency MFA program, formerly at Emerson, and she lives in Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm going to just say a few things about that Major Jackson and Terrence Hayes have said about her poetry. The poet's practice is speed and feeling, a sensuous eye roving over its subjects with a hip distinctiveness that announces style and lyrical sentience. Nicole Terez Dutton's If One of Us Should Fall is all art song with the velocity of seeing that delights any reader's yearning for a new experience with language. And Terrence Hayes, National Book Award winner, has said of Nicole's If One of Us Should Fall, is a sensational in both the laudatory and literal sense. Her poems are full of exacting language and feeling, the swells and pitfalls of desire, the music that swallows us whole. And last, and most certainly not least, everyone here is, I'm big fans of. Jacqueline Woodson is a recipient of a 2020 Hans Christian Andersen Award, as well as a 2020, is it 2021 MacArthur Fellowship, the 2018 Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, and the 2018 Children's Literature Legacy Award. She was a 2018-2019 National Ambassador for the Young People's Literature, and in 2015 was named the Young People's Poet Laureate by the Poetry Foundation. In 2014, she received the National Book Award for her New York Times bestselling memoir, Brown Girl Dreaming, which is also the recipient of a Coretta Scott King Award, a Newbery Honor, an NAACP Image Award, and a Siebert Honor. She wrote about adult books, Read at the Bone, a New York Times bestseller, which I was supposed to bring right to me. I have a stack of everyone's books, but it's way over there and I'm not gonna get up. So everyone, please welcome Tiya Miles, Jackie Woodson, and Nicole Terez Dutton. We're just going to have a sort of loose, informal conversation. I really wanted us to have this panel when we were about to meet last year for us to talk about this, the 1619 Project. And this year, I feel is even more urgent because of the summer that we've had. We've had COVID, we've had this sort of national reckoning on race. But first, I kind of want to maybe ask the question to each, not to each of you, to all of you. What do you think has happened? Like the 1619 Project, it came along, it was in August of last year of 2019. And then now suddenly we have, you know, the outgoing president of the United States, lambasting it, Tom Cotton lambasting it, Ted Cruz lambasting it, the National Review lambasting it. So we have all of these, it's become, the sort of centerpiece and a kind of, sorry, just making sure that's not a fire alarm, and a kind of lightning rod in a way, culturally. So I just wanted to get everyone's thoughts first, and then we'll launch into some of just like, a little bit of reading and general discussion. I might start with, I'm going to start with maybe Taya, because I know that we saw each other in passing pre-pandemic at a sort of local restaurant. And I was saying like, I'm just sort of surprised by this sort of backlash. I mean, of course, I knew some particular instances, there's the part about the Revolutionary War wasn't fought, over slavery. I sort of felt when I read that, I was like, I don't know if that's quite true. But, that seemed to me one thing. And then you were talking about, well, the backlash, you were saying history is this is a proposal here. This is not to say that this is just someone's sort of a dyed-in-the-wool history. This is a kind of reframing and looking at the way in which slavery has been foundational to the US. So just your thoughts on this, Professor Miles.
Sure, and thanks, Zizi, for inviting me to be on this amazing panel. I'm so excited to be here with you, Nicole and Jacqueline. And may I just slip in here? I want to tell Jacqueline Woodson that when Brown Girl Dreaming came out, my kids were a little bit younger then, and every morning at breakfast, we would read a part of it aloud. So,
oh my goodness.
Such a pleasure, such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Zizi, yes. Yes, I mean, what a storm, right?
Yes.
And I think so much of it has to do with unpredictable elements. I mean, the editors of this project, the mother of this project, Nicole Jones, the writers, the readers could not have known the kind of moment that we'd be entering into. We can't control for that. I mean, this is partly the magic and also the ferocity of history. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how things are going to change. And so this compilation of work entered into an atmosphere that was highly charged.
Yes.
And it seems to have hit upon many of the tripwires in our mainstream popular culture. So we're talking about the Revolutionary War and the Founding Fathers and the question of whether or not the United States is, a good and moral nation,
yes,
or whether or not it is a nation culpable for multiple deep foundational sins. I think that many of us were not prepared for the way in which all these issues would come together and explode and actually feed into the current president's extreme anxiety around populations of people of color, around oppositional viewpoints, around the possibilities of radical change. But it did feed his anxiety. And so he launched a very loud, very boisterous, and well-backed challenge. So now here we are in the middle of a fight that has taken on, huge proportions.
Yeah, Nicole, we talked a little bit about, we were just kind of back and forth about some of this and just sort of like, to Taya's point, this has become like to say that it's it's entered into something that's already charged. It's not sort of like, oh, hey, we're now saying, look, how traffic actually is, a result of, slavery and the aftermath of slavery. We're not just talking about the healthcare industry and us not having universal healthcare. Like that, to me, I thought everyone would be so grateful about that kind of parsing out of what historically, how we got to the point that we are at today. But yeah, we've entered this charged atmosphere, and we started talking about how even just one little, what small aspects, end up becoming part of this narrative. And we were talking about it specifically in terms of editing. I was saying, I bet I could see how at a newspaper, at the magazine, at the New York Times Magazine, how this was kind of going to be a turn of phrase that might be something that a reader could latch onto. And yet, then the entire sort of audience, instead seizes upon that. And that becomes this kind of like the sort of the thing that sort of ends up tainting everything. So we talked a little bit about like editorially how some of this worked, and now I'll leave it to your eloquence to.
Zizi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here and to be able to be in conversation with all of you. And then also you just did that thing, which I love, that's your beautiful mind. And you just said like 15 things that I want to respond to. But I'll just back up to the beginning and say that one of the things that I love about this project is the way that it was right on time. It was brewing, but it also was just like, it's so disruptive because it insisted on certain things. It insisted on all of that being complex, being messy, accounting for all, like bringing all the different genres into it, having them participate in a conversation. And then there's this authority, asserting these historical facts and this perspective, this framing, and then all of the intersections that you just mentioned, like all of those things are tethered, and you can't take one thing out. You can't take the salt out of that stew. Like all of them are in there. And so I love how busy it is. And I love also, like I feel, you do know you're doing things right when you strike that nerve, and when people, when it just summons this kind of response. And then of course, who could anticipate all that was to follow historically? I mean, everything that followed this summer. Obviously we couldn't anticipate that, but this was just such a good example of just an intervention, like a piece of art, a creation that serves to be an intervention that just really rattled people awake and made people ask what I think are pretty necessary questions, and to maybe be forced uncomfortably to reconsider these sort of traditional approaches and configurations and angles that have been, I think, over time considered the truth. And I think that, again, once you kind of disrupt those foundational understandings of the story that we tell ourselves of who we are, then you're doing good, beautiful work. But obviously, you were doing something that is going to transform the field and the conversation.
Yeah, and Jackie, I was just thinking, your piece was so evocative. I mean, this piece about the soldier and going home and being on the bus. Like, I just want to know, like, how you came up with, and I want to ask everyone then the sort of nexus of politics, history, and literature. But like, I kept wondering, how did she come up with this? And whenever I read your work, there's this sort of sense of like, oh, she's doing, I just fall into it, and I'm just wanting to just read it out loud, and then also have my boys read it, and them enjoy it. And this was sort of, like all your work, this heart wrenching, but also just sort of like this you borrowed from history, and then you wrote this piece that I was sort of like, okay, how is she doing that? What was your process like in engage you with that?
It's so interesting. First and foremost, I just want to echo you guys and say that it's such an honor to be in this room with you, with so much brilliance and so much talent and so much writing that I've loved. So I just want to thank you for your work. And of course, if we were in the real room, I'd be pulling my books off the shelves and making y'all sign them. So, it's been an interesting journey for me in coming to that piece, the most recent thing that happened was that Sherry Young, I don't know if any of you all remember Sherry Young, she worked for the National Book Foundation for a long time. And the piece is based on her uncle, Isaac Woodward, which I had no idea that was, that connection was there, her great uncle, I'm sorry. And when I was writing it, I think my head was, as always, as in as many places, that's the 1619 issue, right? There's so much going on. And I was thinking about Tulsa Race Massacre, of course, which we're looking at the 100th anniversary of coming up next year. I was thinking about what's happening with trans lives and the way that they do always come at us through our bathrooms. Like when we look at the segregated bathrooms, when we look at what's happening with trans bathrooms and just how that has always been the place that they know they can get us because it's the need that everybody has. And so that was kind of the light for that. It was also coming off of reading Patrisse Cullors, When They Call You a Terrorist. And then, planning this trip that eventually became part of the 1619 issue, which was to Ghana. And then, getting to Ghana and realizing, oh, this is just as complicated as the US as I'm thinking about the places my family can escape to, right? So I think when I sit down to write, it is all of this information coming at me to let me know that nothing is a single issue, right? All of it is so deeply complex, and that's how I got to it. But for me, so much of this year, including election day, was this, right? Everyone was around me watching the numbers and paying attention. I'm like, I'm not here. Like, I'm leaving, I'm gonna write, I'm gonna be somewhere else, but I am not here. I voted early and I'm good. I did my work in Georgia, I'm good. I gave the money to the people, I'm good. But I had to kind of do that because of all of the information coming. And then even with the way that people were coming for 1619, a part of me was just like, nope. Of course you're going to come for this. We're telling the truth, right? And we're in this moment of deep resistance, and of course we're in this moment of reckoning because it's been 400 years and it's time, and people are very afraid of that. So watching all of that, a part of me just kind of shut off and continue, bent toward the page, because that's where I know my power is.
Yeah. Now, do you mind if I don't want to take anything away from you if you want to read your piece?
Sure.
That would be great, because I would love for people to listen to it.
Okay. February 12th, 1946, 17 years to the day before I was born. And when I was born, those colored only signs were still up all over the South, a South I would live in until I was 7 years old. Sergeant Isaac Woodard, in full uniform, boarded a bus in Georgia, heading home to his wife in Winnsboro, South Carolina, 98 miles away from the town in which I was raised. Sergeant Woodard asked the driver if there was time to use the restroom. This was near Augusta, South Carolina, where the driver said, hell no. And then there was an argument, and the driver conceding with a go ahead then, but hurry back. Keep an eye on the history. I'm sorry, I missed the first paragraph, which I need to go back and read. I'm so sorry. They've always come for us through, keep an eye on the restrooms. They've always come for us through them, because who doesn't ever need to use one? Straight peeps and trans peeps, Black peeps and white peeps, we all have to go sometime. And back in the day, if the colored only signs didn't work or weren't enough, or still had Black folks having the audacity to put on a uniform and go fight in a war, let's call this one World War II. They found other ways to come for us. Keep an eye on the history of Black veterans in America, on the thousands that were attacked, assaulted, killed, because they were Black, because they were in uniform, because they had the audacity to believe that leaving this country to fight for it would indeed make it a better place for them to return to. Keep an eye on a white Southern bus driver conceding to a Black man. At a later stop, Sergeant Woodard was ordered off the bus by the local chief of police, Linwood Shull, and another officer. Linwood beat him blind. 2 months later, Woodard's family moved him from the VA hospital to in Columbia, South Carolina, to New York City. At trial, Shull admitted to blinding Woodard. After 30 minutes of deliberation, an all-white jury acquitted him. Keep an eye on the long, bleak history of police brutality against Black men. It happened in America. It happened when many of us were living. It happened again and again. And as Woodard himself said, Negro veterans that fought in this war don't realize that the real battle has just begun in America. It happened on a Greyhound bus to a man who was just trying to get himself home. Sorry, I saw this italics and that was what the Times added in and I didn't want to read it. So anyway, I'm back.
Yeah, and that touched me because, I mean, I've been working for a long time on this, about, soldiers, Black soldiers, and for you to bring all this into as well with police brutality, and here's the summer before, before we have the, not that we, haven't had this happening all through, ever since, emancipation, from slave patrols to the, police coming from the slave patrols, but for you to have that in there, and then us to just be thinking about the police brutality of this particular last summer, that have been Jacob Blake and later and whatever. So how I guess I'm still sounding so awestruck, but you were saying that, like, just keeping focused, and here you are writing about this, someone who's trying to get home, and from the very beginning, to keep an eye on the restrooms in these small places that are often like coffin-like, that you get, that Black people have been then, trespassed upon. I mean, we think about George Floyd, like him just trying to get, home, him trying to go and not being able to. So I don't know. Were you just sort of thinking that, okay, I want to do this soldier in particular, this one in particular? Were you just then thinking, I don't know. I didn't know if, like, Nicole Hannah Jones was saying in particular, do this person,
No, they actually said I could choose. And when I started researching him, just aside from the fact that it happened on my birth, February 12th, just how relevant it was to the moments now. And of course, always thinking about young people and helping to get them to understand history. You have to put it in the context of something that they know now. And one thing that I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but I'm not going to admit it. I didn't realize that lynchings didn't simply mean being strung from a tree. That this was a lynching, right? He didn't get killed, but the brutality on the Black body, the dismembering, the gouging out of eyes, these were all lynching tactics. So that was something I began to understand more deeply in a way that I didn't. But yeah, I ended up choosing him for that reason.
And before I maybe asked Taya if she wanted to read something, since Taya's a historian amongst us, and off of lynching, many more books than I do about this, but the book that stands out to me is At the Hands of Persons Unknown, and about basically how lynching was, in effect, a way of terrorizing Black people who oftentimes had done something that made whites jealous. They would be successful, they would do something well, and then this was this means of terror to then control them, and which continues to this day. So even if we will call some things a modern day lynching, what happened to George Floyd is essentially a lynching. I mean, can you put that in perspective for us as well?
Well, what I will do, Zizi, is to actually try to draw an analogy between lynching and violence against the Black body and the way in which this kind of project, the 1619 Project, has elicited such strong emotion. Because there is actually something there. There's some kind of parallelism there, in that we as human beings, we draw emotional and psychological dividends from all kinds of behavior that might or might not be conscious. And so one of the most fascinating and actually terrifying things to me about lynching is the way in which, as we know, whole crowds and whole communities of white onlookers would come to these moments of extreme violence and participate and even take mementos away from those events and incorporate those events into their sense of self, into their sense of relationality with other people, into their sense of where they fit into a larger society. And it seems to me that a similar thing has happened with the historical investment in what the 1619 Project is doing or what it is proposing. That is, I don't know if we realize the extent to which not everyone, not all readers, but a large percentage of readers out there, people engaging with the project, have a very, very deep investment psychologically, emotionally, in a certain historical narrative.
Yeah.
It's somewhat similar because the historical narrative that is widely invested in is one that, again, consciously or unconsciously, purposefully or not always purposefully, elevates some groups, their memories, their lives over others.
Yeah, I'm so concerned. And anyone can answer this. I'm, part of what I'm interested in with the 1619 Project is like this idea of this origin story. I mean, the idea that we learned about America through like, the 1776, and then here we have the revolution. We have the revolution. We have the Declaration. But then we have this way in which we learn history as this sort of series of triumphs of various Americans, and all of this other history becomes a sort of auxiliary history. Like, women, they gained the right to vote in 1920. Okay, well, eventually Native Americans, they got their land on, reservations. Black people eventually became free. We fought a civil war over. And so this idea of the narrative that we tell ourselves, even with Western history in terms of, let's say, Western United States, in terms of, the myth of the cowboy, but then when someone tries to say, okay, a third of the cowboys were African-American, a third of the cowboys were actually, Mexican-American, like the cowboy originated from vaqueros, from, the Tejanos, who were, and Texas was originally Tejas. This origin story that Americans are like a certain group of Americans are so wedded to. I know I sound naive in asking why is that. I could come up with power relations. You can come up with all sorts of things, but like your idea using narrative gets me to the idea of like, okay, well, storytelling. People will ask, well, why not just have these historical essays? And I'm just wondering what everyone thinks about like the power of story, because we are telling a story. And when we talk about the 1776, that's still a story. And not to say that they're not factual, instances that are part of that narrative, but it is still a story because certain aspects, certain events are being picked. There is an editorial process that's going on, leaving some, by sins of omission that Howard Zinn talks about, leaving certain, events out of the record, then creates one story, whereas this other story is like sort of left off to the side and is not, put on the shelf, is not, as you said, elevated. So I don't know I'm really curious. We're all creative writers, we, Taya's, Nicole, like we all have on these different hats professionally, and yet we all are Black women writers. So what are you doing in your work? Or it doesn't even have to be your work. How are you thinking about these kinds of narratives and this kind of way in which we can't ever be, I feel, separated from them? I sometimes will think like, okay, this summer, Ahmaud Arbery, before that, we didn't know that Breonna Taylor's, death was actually in March when George Floyd, was killed. So all of these, I keep thinking like myself, well, this is now, I'll say, this is taking away from my novel, but I was like, okay, no, I actually have to write this too. This is kind of part of the process. So I'm just wanting you guys to also help me to understand what is this intersection of politics, history, and our literature, you know, that's part of our culture that can't kind of be teased away, at least for me. I was wondering, like, will there be, you know, a day that it's sort of teased out? I don't know. But how are you all taking this? How do you all address this? I may ask Nicole this now since
I think Jackie was about to jump in.
Well, no, I wanted to ask Nicole.
I'm just like,
I was interested in what Nicole is seeing as the editor at the Kenyon Review. You know, how people are writing or not writing about it, and who is writing and who's not writing about it. Like,
you know, yeah, it's really interesting, and it's a particularly interesting question for the Kenyon Review, which has for decades occupied a very particular space kind of on the literary landscape and aspired to do very particular work, you know. And so part of my job and part of, I think, my charge and what I'm interested in doing is really changing, or I would say expanding, who is invited into that conversation. And it represents a cultural change for this literary organization. I think it's an important one, and I think that people are alert to it and interested in it, but it's a matter of establishing new habits of being and doing, and also being and doing within a literary community, I would say. So that is something that is a kind of work that I endeavor to do, and there's a couple of ways that I'm hopeful that we can enact that. But I will say to Jackie's question about the kind of work that we're receiving, we are in the process now of going through 7,600 submissions and so it's very early. And I think that what I'm seeing there's a lot of pandemic, there's a lot of stuff that would situate itself, I think, playing to the last soundtrack that we saw go out last year. So there's a lot of work that, you know, that understands kind of what the political commitments of the literary organization have been to date. And so the things that challenge that, or the things that look beyond that, or the things that really kind of expand that, are the ones that we have sought. And so we're finding a few of those, but I would say I feel like it's you know, it's gonna be a little while before we get there, and before we can be, you know, involved in, I would say, just really kind of understanding that the work is and always has to be necessarily political, and that there's no escaping that, and we have to be open and available to engage in work that is looking at the moment and looking, you know, critically at the moment, you know, and that's a lot of different things, and it looks a lot of different ways. So that's kind of an aesthetic thing, but that's also, I would say, a political orientation thing. Zizi, were you going to say something?
Well, I do wonder, now here's a question also for everyone. You know, we all, you know, work in a way in which our work has to then be submitted to another gaze, you know, and that gaze is oftentimes a white gaze. So I remember Nicole and I were just talking about, you know, just recently this summer, you know, there's a magazine, and we had to sort of ask the question like, oh, is this kind of a racist, not a racist font, but like a font that is kind of, we had all these kinds of questions about like, well, who sees this work, you know, and who's the person over you know, I don't know, I didn't want to say the word overseeing, but the editorial position, the work of the editor is the work of someone who actually has to sort of like say, this goes, this doesn't, you know, and that particular gaze is it the gaze that actually creates a narrative itself, you know. I was also going to sort of I kept thinking about Jackie in particular when I think it was when you won the National Book Award, and then there was this whole, should I mention it? You know, because actually I know the person who said this. You know,
Me too.
Yeah. And we're talking about. This is going to be recorded, but
Okay. It's so
I don't even know if you want to talk about that at all, but like I feel as though we can't catch a break, you know. It's sort of like at any time we're always asked to be sort of gracious if we are trying to stick up. If we try to stick up for ourselves, it's sort of like, oh, you're being a little too aggressive. If you take offense, it's like, oh, you're being too sensitive. If it's so, you know, and those people.
Yeah.
I'm now hesitant to even say the name.
Oh. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we're, you know, especially as women of color, you know, place that people jump to is that angry Black woman thing, right? Even as we walk through this world with every right to be so much angrier than we actually put out on the page. I think even in that moment, you know, with the whole watermelon joke, for me, I remember my friend Toshi Regan was sitting, you know, I had home on my posse there because it had been my 4th time being a finalist. And I'm like, you know what, even if I don't win, I'm just going to bring the whole family and we'll be good. We'll eat this National Book Award food and keep on moving and get, you know, my publisher paid for the tables. But when after Sharon had announced my name and Daniel's talking, my friend Toshi Regan is like, we could curse on this, right? So my friend Toshi is like, he's fucking up. But I'm not hearing anything, right? Because again, I know how to do this. So, but then it sinks in afterwards, right? So it had a slow journey to my head. And in that moment, I was just like, you know, here's Sharon, let me hug this sister who's just given me this award and said it was unanimous. Like, it was a great moment. And then as the fireworks started the next morning and all this information, I was like, wait a second. And then all this press started calling me, and I was like, I have nothing to say right now, because I didn't want a soundbite. I was like, this is going to be something different. And that's when I decided to write the piece for the Times, because, you know, I had to decide where I wanted to put this. And I also wanted to process it, right? I wanted to figure out why does someone need to say something like that instead of saying like, next stop Pulitzer, right? Like, you know, why?
I should have told everyone, I guess now that this was when Jackie won the National Book Award, and Daniel Hannon, also known as Lemony Snicket, you know, made this watermelon joke. And so I just kept wondering why? You know, like, what is the point? And this is something where like it felt, I'll let you continue, but it felt as though, you know, there's this diminishment from this, like this. Yeah. I mean, of course, you can't be diminished. You can't.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to 1619 and the fire. Like, we will not go away. We will not be erased. We will not, even though, you know, the point was to bring us here to work until we die. We did not die, and we went on to do and continue to do all this amazing stuff, including call you out on your stuff, right? Like we are doing in 1619, and America's never ready. And I think in that moment, you know, that was all he had in his pocket, right? Was like, I'm going to tell you this, Jackie's allergic to watermelon. I'm like, what does that have to do with any? Like, it didn't even make sense to me until it made sense. And like, you know, and then the audience is like, what? So it was a bad joke that fell flat. But for me, I wanted to investigate I think so much of the ignorance is people don't even know the history of something. Yes. Like the fact that, you know, people were killed because of watermelons, right? And that this comes from such a broken and racist place that it needs to be, people need to be awakened to that history. And it comes back to this country, what you were saying, this country's not knowing so much of our history and so much of what we've had to survive to get to this moment of having a conversation amongst ourselves about history.
I know.
So,
and part of that history, I mean, when you said that soort of like, I kept thinking of the image and then not knowing the history. And then Wesley Morris has that one, there's that essay where he talks about American music. And it's basically, it goes to American music has its roots in minstrelsy. You know, there was no American music until identifiable as American, and that until minstrelsy. But minstrelsy was an actual, a white man seeing this Black man who was working, adopting what he thought of being of that Black man's image, you know, and shellacking it with his ideas of Blackness, his ideas of someone being lazy when literally they were working, like their ideas of, so all of this stuff, like we were talking about with watermelon, like all these images are kind of these, are these sort of sacred totems in a way to whiteness, even though they are supposedly images of Blackness. And I kept feeling that like this project as a historical project, which is trying to do in some ways, not just this has the job of educating, but also has the job of kind of like dispelling, erasing, and kind of setting things straight, then hits all of these, these areas in which a particular narrative has been promoted over another narrative. And so then it's sort of like, okay, well, we have all of this work to do and sort of undoing the work that has been, done against us. Yeah, and like you said, that he had nothing but that. This was the only thing that he. Yeah.
Easy. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah,
ask?
please ask.
I'm curious for you all as you participated in this project and we're talking about what it's meant and kind of the work that it's done and, like you said, ZZ undone. I'm really curious if this has broken open anything for you and what it means for you as you move forward in this moment with your work.
And that question's for me. I mean, I will say yes. I mean, I think one of the things that happened was when I was, I was submitting various aspects, various sections of my book. And I think partly because, for instance, Taya Miles had already done like Seminole Negroes, who were in Florida, and that was one of the ones I sort of was hoping, one section of my book that I was hoping would maybe be, fine for this. But then, with having to go over this very early section of my book about the New Orleans massacre, which at one point was called a riot, I was just sort of like, I have to relive some of this all over again. I think people don't understand it. Like when you're writing some of this, it's like, you're not just sort of like writing on a sort of typing things out. I have to sort of imagine what's happening, and this was a real event. Like there were, almost 100 Black people who died. This is in New Orleans, at this, what was called a riot, as though they had instigated this, because they simply wanted to exercise their right to vote, at this constitutional convention. And so for me, it's kind of, you said, if there's anything that broke open, I will say, yes, I'm just having to sort of relive all of this. And then to kind of be like, okay, I now have to like look at this other event and sort of imagine, what, these people went through and their characters in my book. And yet when I actually read the history, it's a lot of stuff that like, if I try to write it down as just factual, as history, it tends not to be believed because it's sort of, a lot of it's, that hard and that kind of horrific, And so when I'm reading just, any of the books that I end up having to read, I'm not going to show you my bookcases here, but I just have to stop. I remember when I think it was Iris Chang who, when she was writing The Rape of Nanking, about the Japanese occupation of, in Nanking, it was called Nanking, and that she had to stop. It made her depressed. I just saw on Twitter this another. Well, he's an actual he's a historian, and he talked about, like, I did a class on massacres, and there's a sizable number, that occurred from Civil War on, and he said that's the one course I have not taught again, like the brutality of people who are executed, lynched for having a job, for owning I was doing something on Breonna Taylor recently. I'm still working on that, and just going through the Kentucky history, and like almost a similar thing that ended up happening to Kenneth Walker, her boyfriend, ended up happening to this man who was a slave. He was born illiterate. He learned he learned how to read nominally, He was he became incredibly successful, and a group of people came to his house and said, without anything like a warrant or any of that kind of thing, and decided to said that you have to leave or we're going to take everything. And they shot up at the whole place, took all of his stuff, burned, possessions. His family ended up fleeing to the wind. And he himself was only sort of saved by leaving that town and going to, Louisville, as opposed to the place that he was. But this is not just one case, it's sad that there's case after case after case. So to me, it's sort of heartbreaking, and I have to take breaks. And, I remember when Wesley talked about how Nicole Hannah-Jones said, okay, we're going to have all these devastating essays. You may have to make it a little more light than you might have intended. So yeah, that's emotionally where I've been with it. And rereading the essays, I get that way too, where I have to just kind of take moments and just pause and breathe.
Just like in our writing.
Yeah, just like the writing.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that I was rereading Linda's essay on Black women's health, and and literally I feel like I have to read it with one eye open, right? Because of the physical devastation of the Black female body was just so hard to take it. And there is something in so many of the essays.
You have the beginnings of gynecology coming out of slavery. Yeah.
But the fact that there is a way, I feel like in every essay that I did read, there was this element of hope to it, right? There is something that all the writers brought to what they wrote that made me want to keep reading. And I think that's so much about this, this experience of being a Black person of the diaspora. And that's what keeps us going, is that hope. And it does get instilled in even the most devastating writing we do.
Yes, and I think that point about hope is so important. I mean, it went back to Nicole's question about how, we have felt impacted by writing for the project and experiencing the reaction, some of it really enthusiastic and people feeling transformed, but some of it also very negative and critical and harsh. Within that big grab bag of responses, what I felt most personally affected by and disturbed by and actually hurt by were the charges of pessimism. The criticism that the project on a whole, and therefore writers in the project, were engaged in some kind of very pessimistic, very clouded, dim, grim assault on, our nation, in a sense. And I don't think it could be further from the truth. I think what Jackie said is absolutely right. If we were pessimistic, we wouldn't still be here. We wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't be writing our hearts out. We wouldn't be engaging. We would be turning our backs, walking away, moving to Canada, all those kinds of things that some people are now planning again in our current political circumstances. But that actually, that kind of a criticism, which kind of digs below the material and goes to an area of intent and assumes, presumes, argues negative intent. For me, Nicole, to your question, that's what I felt profoundly affected by. And my reaction has been to try to think more consciously, more carefully. I don't know if it's more effectively, perhaps not, but about all those multiple audiences out there. All those multiple audiences and subsets of audiences who have different stakes and different investments and are going to take this material to heart, but in drastically divergent ways. And I've been thinking about, is there any way that I could speak to some of these audiences differently to actually connect? Because, we've missed one another. If they feel that I or you, any of us, are speaking and writing from a pessimistic place, we're not actually connecting around this material.
Yes, that's beautifully said. Yeah, I mean, one of the charges was, that when the first salvo came out that was sort of against the project, it was like the four historians, perhaps more, who were basically saying, oh, you're not acknowledging all the sort of progressive milestones that have occurred. It's almost as though you're just sort of saying, oh, everything is bad, there's slavery, and now we have everything bad again because of it. And it's like, no, actually, Nicole Tenet's first introductory essay is about the idea of America, and her father being so, patriotic that he, like, despite, the peeling, flaking of the house or whatever, he kept this flag pristine. And it wasn't symbolic like the way Trump hugs the flag, like it wasn't just like, oh, the symbol of the flag. It was actually like what America means, and the sort of promise. And, this idea of democracy, whether or not you think of the nation being a republic or a democracy, representative democracy or not, the idea that eventually, America can live up to these ideals. But then all of these groups, I mean, in particular for the 1619 Project, African Americans, but I look at that and I cannot help but think, and I know Taya, your specialty is also, Native American and African American, but like, Native Americans, I mean, this is sort of like a thing where we can't rest until everyone, the project is like that everyone is liberated, Native Americans, you had Asian Americans who, from the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Page, I'm trying to think if it's the Page Act, Chinese Exclusion Act, Page Act, all of this is such that like Black liberation brings about the liberation of all these other groups, and the liberation, as Ibram X. Kendi talks about, white Americans as well. So yeah, I do think, I know I sounded very maybe, down, I do get down, but yeah, ultimately I am hopeful about what arises out of, as long as we don't turn our backs on history, as long as we actually, don't live in ignorance and actually try to understand our history. But I do want to ask, like, with we talk about history, but like the role of literature, I sometimes wonder, I learned in grad school that there was this sort of like aesthetics versus politics. And I kept chafing against this notion that there's one or the other, and so I'm kind of just wanting to ask you guys, like, do you feel as though what we're doing, it just the political arises in the art, like, or are you just always conscious of it? You can't ever let it go. Are you just writing what you're writing and it ends up containing the sort of body politic in it? How do you guys do this? And Nicole, you're a poet. I mean, not that Jackie's not, Jackie of course is as well. Like, but like, how do you do this? Is it a line that you have to walk? Is it a decision you have to make?
No, I mean, I think that my commitment when I'm writing something is to, first of all, figure out what it is and then to serve that text, but I have the luxury of being a poet, so I can do that. I'm not trying to write, I'm not a journalist, my only real charge for myself as I'm writing something is to figure out what that is, and to build the language to communicate it. So, all of these other things and all of these other kind of priorities that I have, I feel like they're infused in the work and in the thinking behind the work and in the building of the language to convey the work in ways that I guess I'm not interested in trying to take that out or to second guess that, or to manipulate that part of the process. I feel like that's maybe for later, and maybe someone else's work to think about what they think about that. So I just try to be present for the poem and to be as honest to what it needs to be as I can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jackie?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always think about, and I always quoted Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop that talked about the importance of young people having both mirrors and windows in their literature, right? So windows so that they can experience other worlds and learn empathy, and mirrors so that they can see reflections of themselves in the text. And, and being a person of color, coming from an underserved community, I grew up with many white windows, right? And very few mirrors. And I do think it's so ingrained in me that that I am thinking about the person who is absent in literature whenever I sit down to write, and wanting to fill that gap from my childhood, whether I'm writing for young adults, adults, or very little kids. And so I think it's, and that is political, right? That, and so for me, it's very hard. It's kind of like, it's very hard to disengage from, to compartmentalize, because they're so integrated in this way. You know, whether I'm writing about a Black boy or, you know, a poor white girl, like it is about looking at that part that was absent, the economic part that was absent, the gender part that was absent, the sexuality that was absent. And so, and I didn't realize that all of that stuff was political, right? Like,
Yeah.
because it just is. And I think one thing that I always pushed back against in writing workshops, especially predominantly white writing workshops, was that idea of having to explain any of that, right? Yeah. That, or having to qualify any of that. It just is. And so, you know, I was so happy when something like the Kirkus Review decided to qualify everything, right? They're not going to say this book is about a little Black boy unless they say this book is about a little white boy. And there was a lot of resistance coming for that. And I was like, no, because what people are learning is that unless, you know, that whiteness is assumed everywhere. And you know, going back to the 1619, it's like, yeah, what we're saying is no, don't assume this history. Like, there, as you said earlier, like there's so many parts of the history, and we're trying to tell this. And for me, I feel like when I sit down to write, I am writing from this is the body that writing is coming out of, no matter what that story is. And so this is going to inform it.
Yeah, that is beautifully put. And I love that idea of the windows and windows and mirrors, you know, and having both of them. And then this is the idea of, you know, like when you're saying, you saw that there was an absence, and of course you're just writing, you know, so that you are not, you're writing so that your young people can actually sort of see what previously was, you know, was absent. I am in complete agreement. I have the same, or a similar sort of, coming of age in a sort of a graduate program, or one of the first stories I submitted, you know, instead of it, you know, sort of locating this person's Black, this person, whatever, I just located, oh, the white girl, you know, because for her, you know, being Black, you know, whiteness was the thing that was sort of considered, and that this was a kind of thing where everyone was sort of like, well, why are you saying that? You know, why is she, because it was assumed, you know, for them, whiteness is assumed, or, you know, in my mostly white, in my all white workshop, but me workshop. So yeah, this is like a thing where I think that these are these battles that seem little to, you know, the sort of publishing industry, but to us are sort of these, you know, it means that being a human, being not considered other, you know, and otherized, but operating out of your own self and agency. It seemed like Taya was, yeah.
Yes, thanks, Phoebe. I wanted to throw in a couple of ideas about this question of politics. I mean, we can't avoid it. Sometimes, you know, we think we are avoiding it. I think that people in the historical profession especially sometimes think we're avoiding it, and attempt to speak from objective positions and standpoints, but I don't think there is any such thing. We bring ourselves, you know, with us as we do the work, you know, all of us, no matter what, you know, packaging we come in. And the 1619 Project is a political project. Yeah. It is also literary. It is also artistic. It is also scholarly, but it is political. Yeah. And so that critique, I think, is fair. And I will say too, you mentioned, Zizi, that I also do Native American history. And this is one area in which the project is lacking. So I think that it's only, you know, fair to recognize that there's quite a lot that this project has contributed to, but there are also additional erasures and silences that the project continues.
Yeah.
So this is partly what.
Yeah, and I feel as though this is kind of, to me, has always been the sort of role of literature, because like, I feel like, I mean, I shouldn't say role because that makes it seem as though like it's only performing a utilitarian function. But you know, I remember just learning more about Russian history by reading War and Peace, you know, and the Napoleonic Wars than anything that I had actually learned in school, you know, like, I mean, short of, you know, going, sort of college. And this is kind of where you end up learning everything, you know, for me, like, maybe that's because I'm a reader, but that's sort of where I learned everything. And so to your point about indigenous history, you know, until I was writing this book about the Buffalo Soldiers, I mean, I thought, you know, I began this a long time ago. Obviously, I knew they were fighting against, you know, the Apache, in particular, Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apache and the Tenet, and you know, but like the various strands of Native American history that I just did not know until I was looking at it, you know, was incredible. You know, we always think of Geronimo, because Geronimo was like somewhat not minor, but like, you know, compared to you know, Victoria or Cochise or something, like, you know, and this idea of like power and all, like who has what kind of power, this sort of, you know, all of that was stuff that I didn't know. And like, there was just a way in which we just, all these elisions, you know, and then those brought about even more sort of, you know, learning then more about Chinese Americans in the United States. And then of course, you know, there were, you know, Mexican Americans and the Paseños who were in Texas. So sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but this idea of, I kind of feel as though we're kind of asked, literature is always kind of asked to be apart and in this sort of separate silo, you know, from the rest of the world. And as though it's not similar to philosophy, you know, a sort of conglomerate of all of sort of very interdisciplinary in a way.
If you allow me to just jump in, Zizi,
Yeah, please.
to say one last thing that's bouncing off of these ideas that we're talking through now. And that is, I think this is partly what contributed to the great power and impact of the 1619 Project, that it was a compilation, that it was a mosaic, that it combined all these different kinds of creating and thinking in a way that tapped into people's emotional and intellectual responses.
Yeah.
So you asked about the power of story.
Yes.
I think that power of story in the poetry, in the creative pieces, in the artistic pieces, may have actually driven some of the intensity of the reaction to the historical pieces. Mm-hmm. Because story narrative, it just gets us somehow. And I think it has to do with just our functioning as human beings and our brains and how we're wired and how we interact with our lives and our interpretation of our lives. But story gets to us. Yeah. And once we've been gotten to, then it's like all the nerve, you know, endings are tingling, and the history seems to have exploded in people's minds and reactions within that environment. So that was part of the brilliance of the project, but I think it was also what made the project more explosive culturally, the power of story in it.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you kind of unraveled some of this for me, because I kind of feel as though there's this way in which, and I don't know if I should, you know, but I sound like some of my old AFM professors, like we were talking about, like, what is in particular a Black way of doing things, like the kind of, that kind of compilation, that anthology sort of, not just anthologizing, but Nicole and I sometimes talked about this, and you talked about it being sort of like, almost like a constellation, and like all of this sort of, you know, like bits of the universe sort of exploded, and you use the word mosaic. And there's this way in which, you know, similar to, like, I think about how like the Old Testament is like really this anthology of all these different types of writing. There's like, you know, the sort of Psalms and song, and there's also something like this genealogy and sort of history. And then there's, of course, the literal history, and then there's sort of legend and myths. I was kind of, well, sorry, I don't mean to call anyone's religion but there is this sort of power that actually does replicate a kind of way of telling, you know, myth in a way, if there's this sort of conglomeration of sort of styles and genres, you know, to tell a story. And I was thinking about like this just reading recently about Saidiya Hartman, and you know, of course, author of Scenes of Subjection, and how she's now writing, I guess this is in the New Yorker, Alexis Okio was writing about how, you know, she felt as though she could not only just tell history, that she could not just be, I don't want to say just, but be scholarly, that she actually started doing a kind of a combination, which I think she called it, I don't know if she called it critical fabulation, in which she, there's an event and there's a person, and yet she kind of looks at it sort of imaginatively, so that then she can like fully inhabit, you know, a character and make that person seem more like make the character seem more like a person. And this goes back to kind of like, you know, Walter Johnson was one time asked me like, well, how are you writing this? Like, what are your sort of primary sources? And I was telling him, I have to actually sort of do make this imaginative leap. Like once I've like read what I think of as being enough, in a way you have to do this sort of role of inhabiting. Well, we have a couple of questions. I wish I could have been better on time, because I would have read some other bits from the project, the literary project, but we're just on this roll, so I wanted to honor that. The questions we have from Diane Sherwin actually just says, not a question, just a thank you for another extraordinary conversation. Mary Elliott says, I would like to hear the rest of Taya's thoughts as she was talking about the continuing erasures. That's a good one. And I think she also went ahead and said, I'm interested in what the panel thinks about the special broadsheet section paired with the magazine. Oh yeah, all of it's newspaper, but their sense of how all the pieces of the project work together. There's one more from her as well. Also not a question, but I have to thank Jacqueline for showing up on screen with the awesome Howard hoodie. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. But yeah.
My daughter's a freshman there, so I'm very, very excited.
Yeah, and all the HBCU, I mean, this is like this is the age of HBCUs. I mean, there's this sort of like, Jelani's out there, Brittany Cooper's out there, and Ibram, and of course
Ta-Nehisi.
Yes, yeah, Ta-Nehisi, of course. Yes, Kamala. Yeah, I say Kamala as though we just like we hang out. Kamala. I'm about to call her up. Yeah, sorry. So, but maybe we should start with the talking about continuing erasures. That was the.
I have a question about that, add on to that. So there has been writing about that erasure, and people have been pushing back against it. I haven't followed that, so I'm interested in more of that too.
You want to say? Yeah.
Well, thanks to Mary for that question. And I'll try to keep this brief so that we can have lots more time for the other ideas that we're now talking about. 1619 it's a year, it's a date, it's an important date. It's not exactly clear from the documentary record what happened in that year and at that moment, and what the exact status was of those African descended people who were brought to what is now Virginia. And while that is and should be a pivotal story, a central story, an anchoring story in terms of the way we understand the foundings of this country, there are many other stories. And this is partly, I think, a bargain that we strike when we tell any narrative, right? We have to put our stakes in the ground somewhere. We have to have a beginning of the story. Once upon a time, we have to have an end of the story. And yet we know that there is a long line of history, events, happenings, people and their lives before that once upon a time in our telling of the story began. And we know the story continues. If we were to tell a new origin story of the US from Native American perspectives, we would probably be stretching back to the 1500s. We probably would be looking at Spanish colonialism. We might start in California. We might start in Florida. This is just to say that to center one year, one place, one group of people, clearly has to leave out the many other places and the many other peoples who were all wrapped up and caught up in the storm of European colonization and slavery and racialization.
Yeah,
And-
and I feel as though, and I'm never as eloquent as Professor Miles here, but I feel as though what you're saying is that, yeah, we would have started someplace else, and it just gives you this sort of sense of like, okay, with a story, there's a protagonist, there's a protagonist, and that means that the story is centered around that person's version of events, that person's feelings, that person's perspective, like the way they see the world, the way they look at the world, the way they then process the world. And so I think people sort of forget that when we're telling, a story of America, and we pit the story of, the revolutionaries, even our language is sort of embedded with a kind of like a glossing of what happens afterwards, and the sort of fact that it's being told afterwards. And as Alex Haley, reminds us, that history is often told by the winners, And so this idea that, that we're going to tell the story of the revolutionaries, the revolution, where if you didn't win, you're called a rebel. It's called a rebellion, So that even the very language that's embedded, and I would have read not my own piece, but this piece by Jessamine Ward. And one of the things that I noticed that she does when she's talking about the story is she uses the term enslaved person. And when I was a kid, we just used the term was slaves, And the thing is, you had to always get around like, well, they weren't yes, they were born slaves, but they weren't born, they're born into slavery. But no one's born a slave, you know what I'm saying?
No, and what's so interesting about that is that, I'm sorry to cut you off, because this is something I talk to teachers and young people about all the time, and I always try to use enslaved, because to say slave puts the onus on the person who is enslaved, right? But to say enslaved lets us know that this was someone else who did this to this person. And it was so much easier for people to digest slaves. Oh, that's who they are. But the minute you say enslaved, people have to take pause and really look a little bit deeper at this history.
Yeah, and know that that's not an identity, that the identity isn't, to be a slave. That's not the same as being, a person. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So, and then, the decision to say labor camps, like if you use the term like labor to emphasize that the plantations, which has this connotation of beauty, like it's received to us from like these what we think of as like the sort of Scarlett O'Hara Terra, and we don't really sort of think of like what we're saying when we're saying a plantation. And this is a forced labor camp. It looked like the way we think of now how things are organized in multinational corporations. I mean, it had a sort of machine-like way and factory-like way in which it operated, despite its agrarian, despite the fact that it was agrarian. So all of these words that do matter when we act, and the language actually matters when we talk about who's ruling, or even the term of like mastery. You're talking about mastery and ownership. All of that's incredibly political, and yet it's the fact that we use words in a way that it's received, and not in a way in which we're sort of shaping them, which is what literature is trying to do. I do have another question here from Lynn Goldner. Given the entrenched agendas you have described, how can institutions tell a more inclusive history? Any thoughts?
I can talk about schools. I mean, about primary schools and middle schools and high schools. The great thing about 1619 is it's for everybody, right? And so they've done the work of making it accessible to teachers, making it accessible to teachers of young people, so that they can include it in the in the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I have found, I have a 12-year-old son, I have a daughter who went to a PWI for high school, is that teachers don't know how to teach history. Like teachers don't know how to teach history that deals with folks of color, and I'm not saying all teachers, I know there are teachers out there that do. I found that a lot of my children's teachers don't, like just, yesterday, my son was, they're talking about the post Reconstruction, and they're talking about lynching. But the teacher decided to put up some pictures of lynching and said that the kids who can't deal with it can look away. And my son was like, no, they shouldn't look away. Like, he's like, they need to look at this and see this and understand the atrocity of it. But, and asked the teacher about that. And she's like, no, some kids can't, they're 12 years old, can't deal with this. And I just thought it was so interesting because there is a way we can talk about this, and maybe they don't need to look at the pictures, but they need to understand the devastation. And I think that what primary schools, middle schools, and high schools can do is begin to shift that narrative and use these texts. These are texts. I mean, 1619 is a text that they can use. So many of books that talk about harder stuff have teachers' guides and that allow teachers to figure out how to teach it. They could also talk to people of color or parents, or, there's so many places you can go to get a sense of how to teach this history. But I think there is a resistance to shifting because it takes work. It takes work to relearn history.
And also I feel as though there's a way in which if you're trying to make, there's a way in which people are trying to make this more anodyne than it is, Like I remember when my son was in, my youngest son was in kindergarten, and, they were trying to discuss MLK Day. Now, meanwhile, he was going to a school that was called Robert E. Lee Elementary School. We lived in the district where he would go to Robert E. Lee, and I'll describe later. It's now been changed. Me and another decided we didn't want this to happen anymore.
Fabulous.
And it didn't end up being changed until after I left, but we started renamed Robert E. Lee. But in the meantime, you have this kid who's there, and I looked at one of his, one of the sort of worksheets, and it said, there was a time when Black people and white people didn't get along. That was the description of what, they were trying to describe, like, why MLK became, who he was, and they described it that way, and I said, you can't, that wasn't the case, it wasn't as sort of, there was no parity, such that there could be like Black people and white people just didn't get along. One group tried to subjugate another group. So I feel as though the entrenched agendas, you're right. The person who's asking the question, it requires like almost like a crowbar of constant, history, I should say, other texts, knowledge, for us to not let up, and I feel as though that is this wide spectrum. I mean, we've seen from, people writing about, quote unquote Karens. We've seen this about, people writing about police brutality, people like having this conversation about what does it mean to defund the police? What does abolition mean? Like, can we find a different term? Whatever it is, we still have to keep it on the front burner so that people can't forget. And that's my, I'm not pessimistic, but I do have this, my fear is that people, that you'll have, when I say people, that they will, this will be something that we talked about in the summer of 2020, and then as other, issues occur, that it will be forgotten. And I just don't want people to forget it. So I feel as though, for me, we have to continue telling these stories and shaping them in various ways and forms so that they're still, front and center. I don't know if anyone else has an answer to that.
I don't have an answer, but I do have a brief comment just to say that one of the huge successes to me of this project is that it models a way to have these conversations. And I mean, I know I said before it was an intervention, but I feel like it's more positive than that. Like, it's fundamentally hopeful as a project because it offers all of these opportunities to, one, think about history as not something that we can just seal away in terms of our own assumptions and notions. Everything is open. Like, there's still electricity. We can still go back to it. We can engage not just like as a curatorial effort, that the fact that it is kind of this multifaceted, it's its own form, so I think it just feels very dynamic to me. It invites all of these possibilities for looking, for reading, for reconsidering, for asking questions, for the language, for interrogating so many aspects of this history. So I just feel like that's enormously generous, first of all. but also it's powerful, and it just feels to me fundamentally hopeful.
Mhm, mhm. And for the poetry, I know we have a couple more questions here, which I'll definitely get to before we end. But since you're I always love talking to Nicole about poetry. I'm a failed poet. And so being able to ask her, like, when I'm reading the poetry, I'm sort of like, okay, this is sort of different from Yusef's normal, like when I think of him writing, like, how does that then, sort of pry open the agenda? Like, here's like this one, I know that you're talking about how multifaceted it is, and I'm asking you specific, like with poetry, like we normally don't think of poetry as doing the work of history. Like, in what ways do you feel as though this also then engages? Is it merely because it's on a historical subject, or is it how the poet is centered themselves, like how Jacqueline described herself as like, here's the body, here's who I'm writing from, and this is, I didn't know it was political at the time, earlier, but it inherently is.
Yeah, well, I feel like all of these poems seem like they each have their own project, and I think you're right. It seems to me like this is work that looks really different in general from the rest of the work that you see these poets writing.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that it seems like they have come out of their comfort zone, or they're operating in a slightly different mode. But and I feel like they've got different narrative strategies that they're engaging, and making us look. I feel like they're at all of these poems are searching, and they're asking quite a lot of the readers. But I feel like they're welcoming, and offer us different opportunities to enter, different ways to enter.
Yeah.
Like the erasure poem, I'm thinking,
Reginald
like,
Dwayne Betts.
yeah, Beth's poem is, it's just like, it looks so aggressive on the page,
Yeah.
and I feel like it's just really, it makes the reality of that kind of erasure, it makes the feeling of that kind of resonate. Like, you can't look at that and feel that there's something neutral happening. It just feels so, like I said, aggressive, and I think it communicates that. So I just think that when I look at the poems as a whole, it just it's a whole kind of buffet of ways to think about this music and the silence, and space on the page, and a variety of different perspectives and voices. Like, this feels like a chorus all on its own.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't. People probably can't see the Reginald Dwayne Betts poem. I'm afraid to do a share screen because I don't know if I'll be able to, to unshare it. If my past Zoom life has told me anything, but it kind of looks like. Oh, thank you! Yay! Nicole did it. Yes, it looks like that. I was about to show you, turn my computer around so you can see it. That's what it looks like, and I mean, would you call this a found poem? This is what I've learned to be perhaps called a found poem, but it's doing something more than being a found poem, because he's doing I guess it's an erasure poem.
I agree with you. I think this is an erasure poem of a found text. So he's intervening and drawing our attention, to different aspects of this poem by.
I'll just briefly read it. It doesn't take very long to read, although it's like he's forcing it. And I'm going to ask you, because I learned that the sonic line, there's the line, and then there's a sort of maybe what long about called the sonic line or something like that. And the way that form operates to sort of visually make you see the end of the line, and but your brain is also sort of processing the sort of sounds as well. And so this Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which he then takes it and erases, obviously, as you can see, and literally blacks out, it's like different from even just like erasing, fugitive, persons escaping, a fugitive, any person, fled, person, the person fled, prisoner, the fugitive, he or she fled, fugitive, fled, the person, not imprisoned, not held, the person, fugitive, judge, United States, the state shall be made, city, county, city or town, oral testimony that the person fled, the fugitive fled, knowingly and willingly, such fugitive, given harbor, fugitive recovered by saving his account of injuries. And I was like every, I read that very haltingly, and I actually wish I had made Nicole read it instead of me reading it in my non-poet voice. But you're that you're missing all these other words, which is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and he's made another text out of this, which I just think is just so, I don't know, it gets me every time. I just, I didn't know if you want to say one more thing about that, Nicole.
Really briefly, just again, we're meant to look at the language here too, because this is a person who is not initially described in terms of their personhood, or they vacillate, right? It's like the person, and then just all of that is just becomes the fugitive. Like this person slips somehow, even within this, within this is a legal, right? A legal document. The person somehow slips out of personhood by the end of this. Like we're not interested in any of that. So I feel like that is, again, like the violence of that decision is communicated really effectively. And I think you read it beautifully, because ZZ, I think that it's meant to be halting. And I think if you can cruise through this easily, that seems to me a problem. This is not a text you should be able to negotiate easily.
And it's made to look like, this sort of cage, like it's sort of made to look as though it's imprisoned, or like these bars that are, it I don't know, resembles to me. So maybe I'm going too far in saying that, but it.
Well, it looks like a redacted CIA report. I mean,
yeah,
all of the layers. I mean, the sense of kind of superimposition in this poem. Hearing you read it again reminded me the first time that I read it, when I was just thinking, wow, it's almost impossible to keep track of the various ideas that are coming into association and connection in experiencing a poem like this. And that leads me to want to come back to what Nicole said, which was so beautiful and so apt, about how the project, and I'm going to add a parentheses, this is coming from Taya, for all of its limitations, the project offers so many ways to enter. It offers opportunities, it offers possibilities. It is actually not the Bible. Zizi, you brought up the Old Testament. I think that part of the reaction to this, seemed as if people felt like this is now a new Bible. And there's some kind of prescription from on high of the New York Times magazine that says this is the new history of the United States. No, history has its own methodological constraints. We know that, but it is also a craft.
Yeah.
It is right in there. It is cousin, I would say, to fiction and to poetry. And it is not the kind of production to be taken literally, as if it is absolutely closed, doesn't have ambiguity, will never change, and cannot be interpreted. I think that's partly where the rub came in for people, is that many readers who felt strongly critical perhaps were not seeing it, as Nicole described it, as a wonderful set of possibilities and opportunities and open doorways.
Amen. That sounds good. Yeah, I didn't mean to say the Bible is an authoritative. I meant to say, but I'm in complete agreement. Yes, everything that you said. This is like, people have this idea of, I know I'm ruining I wanted to end on what you said because it was so beautiful, but people have this idea that it's like it's coming down from on high. And you're right. I think I always sort of forget the imprimatur of the New York Times magazine means, I think of it as sort of like, oh, I'm writing some little thing for the, people have this idea that it's coming from on high, and it's doing a kind of rewriting, like writing over, so there's no words there. You can't see but it's sort of blacking out everything. And no, it's actually, it's sort of saying, okay, here's what's hidden behind, the words that you guys have here. Yeah. I'm sorry. I wanted to end on everything that you said, because that was fantastic. We have some fans, Rose Weaver, who's a fan of Jackie here, saying, I loved reading your autobiography of a family photo. Are you teaching any virtual writing classes? I know we're a little bit
still in the world somewhere.
What?
That book is still in the world somewhere.
No, and
It's
Harvard,
so out of print.
all the books are.
Yeah.
But you know, she wanted to know Radcliffe, which I'll leave for maybe later because we have a recording of everyone's the remaining questions and
Okay.
questions directly to everyone else. But it's
How do we access those questions?
Hmm?
How do we
yeah,
access
exactly.
those?
Yeah, they compiled the questions, so I'm going to go ahead and send those to everybody.
Okay.
At the end. But I did want to thank everyone for joining me in this discussion. I just wanted it to be sort of like we are all talking about like what this is rendering, what it wrought, like what are the possibilities going forward, and just to have this time with all these, with three brilliant, amazing women who I'm fans of. Well, I'm a fan of you. And I just want to thank you from the Watson Center, from Brown. And I hope to see you all soon in this in a post-pandemic world in person and not just virtually. So thank you everyone for attending.